Hey everyone, welcome to the sample project and the tutorial on a brief overview with Mecanim. So in this particular project, we're basically going to show you how to use models and animations and set up animation controllers using Unity's Mecanim system. So what I've done here is this is pretty much a standard project. It has an empty scene right now. I have downloaded an asset pack from the Unity asset store, and this asset pack basically contains models and animations for zombies. It has a zombie boy and a zombie girl, both rigged models with animations. Now typically, as we mentioned earlier in the lecture, when you work with a team, you're going to have an artist and an animator on your team, and this is what they're basically going to give you as a developer. They're going to give you a model with the textures or the different skins that model can have, and then they're going to give you the rigged model with the animation. So you can see that this is the model of a zombie. In the inspector, when you select this, you can see the model, and there are a bunch of settings which we won't get into right now. There are some basic settings to define what kind of rig does this model have. So as you can see, the animation rig for this is a humanoid. Now we're not going to get too much into changing these settings right now, but what you need to understand is that a humanoid rig will basically have a very human-like skeleton, and you can use that skeleton to animate the model. And finally, we have the animations tab. So here you can actually see that the artist has made a lot of animations for this particular model, and you can select each one and get a preview of it. So let's select crouching and see what that looks like. Well, that doesn't look like much. And the reason for that is that typically when you work with an animator or you work with an artist, they'll give you a really large clip that contains all the animations for that model. So this is that large clip. If you look at the timestamps, it starts at 0 and basically ends at the last time. So this entire clip is around 12 seconds long. So if I play it, you'll be able to see all the animations playing out one by one. So now you can see that the walk animations are into play, the model seems to be running, and the death animations and getting back up. You get the idea. So basically what the artist has given us is the entire clip that contains all the various animations for this model, and he's also gone a step ahead and given us the individual animations which have been excerpted from that large clip. So for example, the run animation is something that just loops over and over again and keeps the model in that animation state. So you can take a large clip and excerpt it out yourself, and that's very, very common. For the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to stay away from that aspect. You feel free to explore that on your own. For this project, let's just assume that we have a really good artist on our team who's given us a really good model of a zombie boy and a zombie girl, and all the animations have already been excerpted out for us and are available for us to use. Okay, so we saw the model, we saw the different animations that come with this. Now let's do something with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this model and put it in my scene, and let's take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so I can see the back of the zombie. So what I'd want to do is I'd want to turn him around 180 degrees. So now I can see his face, and the goal of this tutorial would be to activate the zombie to walk slowly towards us, And as the zombie is walking towards us, we're basically gonna click on the zombie with our mouse and hit it, and the zombie would have to then get hit, and once you exceed a maximum number of hits, the zombie is just going to fall back and die. Fairly simple and exciting stuff. Alright, let's get to it. So now that we have a model in place, what we need to do is put an animation controller in place. So Mecanim provides us an animator component. Now this has already been added for you in this particular model, and if you don't see it, what you can do is just go to add component and click animator. Now understand, there is also something called an animation. This used to be the legacy animation system, so you don't want to use that. What you want to use is the animator. The artist has done a really good job and already put that component into that particular model prefab. So we're just going to go ahead and use the component that's already been attached. Now take a look at the different components that make up the animator. So you have something called the controller, and you have something called the avatar. Now if I click on the avatar, you can see that this is essentially a mesh that is attached to this particular animation controller. So we basically just dragged that mesh over there, and what we need to add is an animation controller. Now this is where the bulk of your work as a developer is going to come through. So let's go ahead and create a new animation controller that will help us define the different states for this particular zombie. So you can click create animator controller, and let's call this zombie controller. Okay, cool. So now we have a zombie animation controller, and in order to look at what this looks like, you have to go and switch to the animator view. So you have the scene view, you have the game view, and then you have the animator view. Perfect. Now when this is selected in the animator view, you can basically see the state machine that is driving this particular animation controller. And right now it looks like nothing much. It just has one state that's labeled any state. So let's think about how we want our model to be animated. Now when the game starts, I want the zombie to be in its idle state. I want it to have, you know, an idle animation ongoing, and it's not really doing much. So that would be our first default state. So what I did was I right clicked, I went into create state, and I clicked empty. So this gives us our first state, and let's go ahead and call this idle. So now we have created our first state, and we've changed its name to idle. Now what the state basically needs is an animation clip. Now if you remember from our discussion earlier on, we were speaking about how the animator has been really nice and given us excerpts from the larger animation clip, and he's excerpted out individual animations for us. Now all we need to do is assign one of those animations to this particular state. So I'm going to go ahead, and so there are a couple of ways to do it. You can just click here and switch to the assets view, and you can see all the animations that can be supported by this controller. So I'm just going to go ahead and select idle normal. Alright, cool. So we have created our state, an idle state, which is our default state for the zombie, and we've applied the idle normal animation clip to it. So let's take a look at what this does. If I press play, it does nothing. We just see the 3D model in the scene, and the reason for that is because we've not assigned the animation controller to the animator component. So I'm going to just drag the zombie controller and assign it to the animator component for this particular model. Let's try to see what that looks like in the game. Cool. So now you can see the idle animation being applied to this model, and of course the animation is looping in nature, and so the zombie keeps breathing really heavily. That's creepy. Okay, so we've put the animation in place, and we have created our animation controller. We've assigned one state, and we've put the animation for the idle state in place. Alright, now what we need to do is make the zombie walk. And if you look into our list of animations, we have a bunch of walks. So let's preview a couple and see what they look like. So I'm going to look at funny walk. Okay, elegant, not really scary. So let's look for something a little more zombie-like. Okay, so he's made something called a simple walk. Yeah, I think I'll go with this one. So again, I want to make this zombie walk, and what I need to do is create a different state. So I'm going to go right click, go to create state, and create an empty state. Cool. If you notice that this particular state bubble is not orange. Now, as a convention in Unity, the orange color denotes the default state for any animation controller. And that's why it's very common to work on projects where you'll find that the orange state often happens to be the one that bears the idle animation. Alright, cool. So now we have a new state which we want to call walk. So we've changed the name, and we need to now assign a particular clip to this. So I'm basically just going to go and drag simple walk, which is an animation clip, onto the motion property for this state in the inspector. Alright, great. So we have two states in our animation controller. We have the idle state with the idle animation, and we have the walk state with the walk animation. Okay, let's get back to the scene view. So now when we click play, our zombie is still breathing really heavily, but how do we make it walk? We switch to the animator, and now you can see that the idle state is looping over and over again. And this is a particularly interesting feature of Unity and Mecanim. You can actually look at the animation controller being executed in runtime. So at any given time, you can, so let me drag this out somewhere here, so you can actually see the animation playing out side by side. Now, what we need to do is get let me just store that for a second. Okay, what we need to do is we need to be in the walk state for the walk animation to play. So the way we change states in an animation controller is using transitions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a transition from the idle state to the walk state. And the way to do that is I'd right click the idle state, and I'd click make transition. And this gives me this arrow that I can then attach to another state. So now I've created a transition from the idle state to the walk state. Now, is creating a transition enough? You basically, the point I'm trying to make is you need to have some sort of action for it to know that, okay, I need to take this particular path that we have created from the idle to the walk state. And the way you make this transition happen is using a trigger, right? So first of all, let's look at what this transition would look like when it does occur. So in the inspector, when you highlight it, so right now I'm highlighting a state, again, I'm highlighting a state. When you click on the transition, it actually gives you more information about that transition in the inspector. So here you can see that on the timeline, you have the model in idle state, and then it gently transitions into the walk state. And you can adjust that timing over here to make that transition rather slow or rather sharp. And if I preview this, this is what it's going to look like. So you can see that the idle animation was kind of running, and then slowly it just very gradually faded into the walk animation. Alright, so coming back to the activation of this transition. So we have the two states, we have the transition. Now we need to trigger this transition when something happens in the game. And the way we go about doing it is adding a trigger. So at the bottom of the animation controller, you will see something called parameters. And let's add a parameter to this. So when you click the plus sign, it asks you what kind of parameter is this going to be. Is it going to be, you know, an integer, a float, a boolean, or a trigger? Now, what does this really mean? So sometimes you want things to change based on a change in a floating value. So for example, you must have played a lot of role-playing games where when you keep the forward arrow key pressed, the character just continues to run forward. And basically what's happening there is, by pressing the arrow key, you're actually providing a continuous signal, and that signal happens to be a floating point value that's continuously changing over time. And then you can assign that value as a parameter that controls the animation. For this sample, we really just need something that causes it to shift instantaneously from idle to walking state. So let's just use a trigger. And we got to name this trigger. So we'll call it walk trigger. And a trigger essentially gives you this little checkbox, which when you activate will cause that transition to happen from idle to the walk state, and then it will turn itself off once you reach the walk state. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So let's segregate the game view one more time. Okay. So right now you can see that it actually did trigger automatically. Let me play that again. It was in the idle state and then it started walking. Let's look at the animator view and see what happened. So it actually just made that transition on its own. But if you notice, the checkbox for the trigger didn't really come on. See, that doesn't come on, and now you're in the walk state. So that's not exactly what we're looking for. So let's look at when this transition needs to occur. So let's click the idle state, and here you can basically look at all the transitions. This particular section will give you a list of all the transitions that emerge from the idle state. And right now, this transition from idle to walk basically just happens on its own. And the reason for that is it just says when the idle transition reaches an exit time of 0.75, just shoot off into the walk state. And that's why it's running automatically. So what we need to do is change that to point to walk trigger. Okay. So what this does is it's telling this state that, hey, there's a condition in place that if you're in the idle state and you receive a walk trigger, fire this transition from idle state to walk state. Okay, so let's put that hypothesis to the test. Press play. So good. it doesn't automatically transition to the walk state, and it continues looping the idle animation in the idle state. Now let's go ahead and fire the walk trigger and see if that transition actually takes place. So I'm just going to click it, and also note this checkbox will automatically get cleared as soon as I'm in the walk state. So here goes. So it did make the transition, and it did clear the checkbox. So that's good. Let's run that one more time. And there you go. So surprisingly enough, the walk animation does not seem to be playing, at least in the game view or in the scene view, but the state seems to be running as expected. Okay, let's take a look at that. So I'll click the walk state and I'll click the animation here, and I think what's happening is it's not looping quite right. So this was simple walk, if I remember. Simple walk. And that's really strange. It should actually just be okay. So I don't think the loop is set. And is that set for idle? Yeah. So you can see the difference is that the idle animations have been set on loop, whereas the walk animation has not been looped. So let's look for a walk animation that actually does loop. Interesting. So how do we deal with this? So we have a set of animations, some of which we want to loop and others which we don't want to lose. However, as you can see, these have been grayed out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the animations list and select simple walk, like so, and I'm going to change the loop time flag on this. I'm going to set it, and I'm going to hit apply. Okay, now this animation should loop whenever I hit this trigger. Perfect. Okay, so I have basically fixed that particular looping issue with the animation. And yeah, this was by design. And what I wanted to highlight was that when you take a long animation clip and excerpt different animations from it, you can also alter different properties about those specific animations using some of the options shown here below. We're not going to get into things like transform position and transform rotation or baking animations into pose, but looping is something that's really simple, and it's often the most commonly used property in the animation controller. Okay, getting back to the goal at hand. We have our zombie, and we have our animation controller, and we have a trigger that gets set and transitions us from the idle animation to the walk animation. Think about this now. You have a state machine that's really just one directional. So your zombie can go from idle to walk, but it can't really go back from walking to staying idle. And that's not really how things should be. So we should make a transition again from the walk state all the way back to the idle state. And this is a very common practice, that if you have states where unless you have an intermediate state where you have to do something before you actually go on to another state, to have two transitions, a forward and a backward transition between two states, is really, really common. So let's look at that transition, and again, as you can see, this time we're in the walk state and we kind of go back to the idle state. And again, when do we want this to trigger? When do we want this transition to trigger? So we'll create a new trigger and say idle trigger. Okay. And as we did with the previous one, we want to make sure that the state knows that the condition for this transition to happen is not automatic. It's not based on an automatic timing mechanism. Instead, it's based on a triggering mechanism. Okay, let's take a look at that. So when I hit play and go back into the animator view, we're currently in idle, and when I launch this trigger, it actually went in really quickly. So when I launch the walk trigger, it starts walking and it starts looping into the walk state, and now when I hit the idle trigger, it's going to go back into the idle animation. Cool. So we've created a very, very simple animation controller with two states which allow our zombie to be animated between idle and walk states. Now, if you remember, the goal of the sample was to have a zombie that walks towards us, and then we're able to kind of hit it, and so it needs to react to it being hit. And so what does that look like? Well, that looks like yet another animation. So what we need is a third state, which we'll call hit. So again, I've created a state using the create state menu option in the menu, and now I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it hit. And I've renamed the state, and now I need to attach an animation clip to that state. So let's look at a really nice hit animation. So we'll select our model again, and let's see, hit 1 and hit 2. Let's see what that looks like. Ooh, that's bad. Let's see what hit 2 looks like. Oh, in the face. Okay, I like this one. So what I'm going to do is assign hit 2 to the animation, to the motion field in this particular state in my animation controller. And again, we want to make sure that we can hit the zombie whether it's standing still or whether it's walking towards us. So for that, we need to make, yes, transitions. So we have a forward transition, and we have a transition that goes back. So you can see that it's transitioning again based on a time condition, and instead of a time condition, we want it to be based on a trigger. So let's add another trigger, and this time we'll call it hit trigger. Now that the trigger is created, I'm going to make that condition point to that trigger. So now every time I fire the hit trigger, I should basically transition from idle to the hit state and then back when the hit animation is about to end. Now if you remember, we don't want, now the hit animation is not a looping animation. It does not loop continuously. It's not something we want the zombie to keep doing over and over again. He gets hit in the face once, and then he recovers and continues, doing what he was doing earlier on. So here we will use time as a condition to manage the exit from this transition. So let's see what that looks like. So we have our, let me see if I can get you, oh, that's okay. So we have our zombie and it's currently in idle, and now when I'll fire the hit trigger, it should basically take this transition, get hit, and as while the hit animation is about to end, return back to the idle state. Let's see if that happens. Perfect. So let me see if I can expand that out a little bit for you so you can see what that looks like, and then let's hit it again. Boom. So our zombie is getting hit in the face and coming back to being idle. Now I want to make it walk, so I'll fire the walk trigger. So you can see the zombie is actually walking, and now I want to hit it again. So I fire the hit trigger, but nothing happened. And the reason nothing happened is because there's no transitions from the walk state to the hit state. Alright, let's stop it there. Okay, so now we need to make, so we want to have the ability to hit the zombie whether it's standing still or whether it's walking towards us. So let's go ahead and make a transition from the walk state to the hit state, and from the hit state back to the walk state. Again, we want the transition from the walk state to the hit state to be driven by a trigger, and we already have one trigger for controlling the hit animation. So let's go ahead and make this transition point to the hit trigger, and once the zombie is hit, we want it to return to the walk state, and so instead of using a trigger, we'll just use the exit time condition to go back. So now you actually have a state machine that starts off in the idle state and can branch out into the hit or the walk state depending on which trigger is fired, and once the zombie is hit, it can return back to the original state that it came from once the animation is ending. So let's take a look at what that looks like, and I'm going to zoom in just to get a nicer look at the animations. So I'm going to press play, and now you can see our zombies in the idle state. I'm going to make it walk, so I'm going to fire the walk trigger. It's walking, and now I'm going to hit it by firing the hit trigger. Boom, it takes a hit to the face. Whoa, it just returned to the idle animation. Tricky. So the reason it returned to the idle animation is because we have in our animation controller two states which are both time dependent. So yeah, if you look at the conditions here, there are exit times on both these two states. So basically, when you're in the hit state, the animation completes. It's like, oh, I'm almost towards the end of this animation. Let me take a pathway and go back to that state. So one of these needs to change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this transition by selecting it and deleting it. Yes. And I'm going to delete the transition from the idle state to the hit state as well. And the reason I do that is because there's no point having a transition where it's standing still, it's hitting, and it can't really go back to that base state. So now we have a slightly modified version of our state machine where excuse me, where we can only hit the zombie once it starts walking towards us. Okay, cool. Let's press play and take a look at our zombie. So here he is in idle state. Let's put him in the walk state, and now we can hit him as much as we want, and he'll keep walking towards us. And if you notice, there's a slight turn in his motion as he walks towards us, and that's because the animator actually turns the zombie after the hit animation takes place. So yeah, so that it's a really minor detail, but it's something that we should keep in mind, especially if you're working with an animator. This would be a point of feedback for me to say that, hey, your zombie keeps turning every time it gets hit, so either I have to account for it when I code, or they have to redo the animation and make sure there's no turning. For this sample though, I think this is pretty simple. Okay, cool. Now if you remember the initial goal, it was to make sure that we can click on the zombie and hit the zombie with our mouse. Okay, let's dock that back there and go to the scene view. So in order for that to happen, we basically need to have a script, and that script will basically check for our mouse clicks, and if those mouse clicks happen to be on this particular zombie, we want to make sure that we fire the transition. So before I even get into that, let's see if I can programmatically trigger. So far you've been seeing me manually checking these boxes and causing the triggers to occur, which cause the transition from one state to the other. Now that's not how, while you're playing a game, nobody's going to be sitting on the sides pushing checkboxes. All this has to be done programmatically. And so the way I go about doing it is I use the animator component to cause the triggers to fire. Let's write a little bit of code now. So I'm going to attach a game component, a script called a game controller. So let's look at new script, and I'll write game controller. Okay, and let's get into the script. Okay, this is not, yeah. So we have an empty mono behavior which is called game controller, and this is where we're going to programmatically trigger all the animations within our animation controller. But in order to do that, we basically need to have that component first. So I'm going to create a public variable called animator, and I'll call that anim. Cool, let's save this. Alright, let's go back into the editor, and boom, you have an anim variable that can now be set in the editor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag zombie boy and attach its animator component. So the animator component has now been attached to my game controller script. So that means I can now access its animator from within my script. Okay, so let's do a really simple test with a keyboard. So if input dot get key, wow, my autocomplete's not working. I think it's get key up, and it's key. Okay, so what I'm basically doing here is I'm saying that if actually let's just make this space. If the space bar is pressed, I want something to happen, and that something would be triggering the hit animation. So I would be saying anim dot set trigger and in here I can provide the name of my trigger. Let me refresh mono develop. I think it's lost track of my auto completion, and it's really difficult to code without it. So I'm going to try and restart this and see if that problem gets fixed. Okay, let's try that out. Perfect. So when you look at the argument options for the set trigger method for that animator, you have an integer, an ID, or the more commonly used approach is you have a string name that you can provide it. So if you go back to the editor and look at the animator pane, you can see that we've given each of our triggers a name, and we can basically use that to trigger our animations programmatically. So let's just make it walk when we press spacebar. And so I'm going to say walk trigger. Okay. So now what this should do is whenever I press the spacebar, it should fire the walk trigger. Let's save our script and let's return to the game view. So it's an idle state right now. I'm going to press spacebar right now, and boom, you can see that it started walking. Okay, great. So using the animator component and accessing the set trigger method, we can basically fire the triggers programmatically and make those transitions that these triggers are associated with. Okay, so now what I want to do from my game is that when the game starts, I want the zombie to start walking, and then I want the ability to start hitting it and knocking it out, right? So when the game starts, I want the animator to basically make my walk trigger occur, and when I press the spacebar key now, instead of the walk trigger, I want the hit trigger to get fired. Okay, so when the game starts, my zombie should already be in the walk state, and when I press spacebar, it should shift between the hit and the walk states. Okay, cool. Let's take a look at how that looks. Okay, he's walking, and now I'm going to hit spacebar. Ooh, in the face. Okay, so that looks pretty good. But let's take a look at the scene view. This guy isn't really walking, he's just being animated in one place. Like he's not really crossing the boundaries anywhere. So what this animator has done is he's given us very simple animations that don't apply motion to the actual model. So some animators, when they make animations, what they'll do is they'll apply the motion onto the transform of the model. So you might have other animators who might do a very different job and give me animations that actually cause the zombie to walk if the walk animation is triggered. But that's no big deal, because all we have to do is basically change its position, and let's say, so our camera is facing this way, so we want to make him walk forward, right, in the Z. So I'm just going to attach a simple script, and I'll call it zombie controller. And this script is basically going to make my zombie move forward just a little bit every frame. And since I want it to move forward in the Z direction, I'm just going to attach, what is that? I'm just going to attach a really small change every frame. So let's see what that looks like. And play. So now you can actually see that my zombie seems like he's walking forward. But wait, he's actually walking backwards. So what we need to do is apply a negative change in the Z direction. So let's press, okay, cool. Let's press play. And now you can see the zombie is moving forward towards our camera, and it's going to get bigger and bigger as it walks further towards the camera. Okay, great. So we have created an animation controller, attached it to the animator component, added transitions to that animation controller, added states to that animation controller, connected those states using transitions, and we can activate those, we can trigger those transitions from one state to the other using these triggers. The next thing we've done is we've learned how to programmatically trigger these transitions using the animator component for a particular model. And finally, when the motion of an animation is not baked into the model itself, the motion of the model is not baked into the animation itself, we can just apply a simple change to the transform to make models move while they're being animated. Cool. And so we have our game where if I now press space, my zombie gets hit and it continues walking in the forward direction. Okay. So that's how you can basically use models and animations and create very simple animation controllers to bring them to life. Thanks for watching this lecture, and I hope that you enjoyed it and this was simple enough for you to follow. Thank you.